Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another NASSP webinar. My name is John Norai and I will be your moderator. Our topic today is supporting students in schools in the aftermath of a crisis, and today's presenter is Dr. David Schonfeld, Director of the National Center of School Crisis and Bereavement, as well as a professor of pediatrics at the Drexel University College of Medicine. As you participate in the webinar, we invite you to expand the conversation on Twitter using hashtag NASSPwebinar. During the webinar, Dr. Schonfeld invites your questions. Please submit them using the chat box on your GoToWebinar panel. He will respond to as many questions as time permits during the Q&A period at the end. And if we run out of time, we'll attempt to answer all those questions that are left via email to you individually. Again, the Twitter handle is at NASSPwebinar. You can follow NASSP on Facebook at facebook.com/principals. And of course, you can visit our website at www.nassp.org/webinar videos. If you have technical problems during the broadcast, you can contact Rich at 703-860-7259. And now I'd like to turn today's program over to Dr. Schonfeld.
Okay. Well, thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really how to support children in the aftermath of a crisis. And I'm going to be using examples of major crisis events, whether they're school crisis events such as school shootings or natural disasters, or whether they be community crisis events. But I do want to point out that the information and the strategies and approaches are going to be relevant for students who are having a personal or family crisis as well. So you don't have to wait for a tsunami to occur to use some of this information. You can likely use this every day whenever you're interacting with kids in school that have had a difficulty. And as I'm sure many of you know, that would be pretty much every day. You will have at least some children who are having some events that are causing them struggles. So what I wanted to start with is just some very practical suggestions to begin with. And I'm going to begin by talking about psychological first aid. So in the immediate aftermath of a major crisis event, psychological first aid should be provided broadly to all of those who are impacted by the event. And it involves simply offering psychoeducation and supportive services. The goal is to foster effective and normative coping strategies and adjustment, and simply to accelerate the natural healing process. You don't screen for individuals to give psychological first aid. You provide it to everyone who may be impacted by the event. And all adults who are working with children, not just mental health staff, not just health professionals, but really anyone, should understand the likely reactions that children may have after a traumatic event or other crisis and how to help children cope. The reality is that anyone that interacts with children and their families can be a potential source of assistance and support if they've had sufficient preparation and feel like they know what to do and take action. But if they're unprepared, particularly if they're unsympathetic or not empathic or insensitive, they can actually become a source of further distress. So, I always tell people that their organizations will be remembered either by the one singular act of kindness and consideration that is extended by any member of that system, which is often a front office staff member or someone who has a support role in the organization. But they can also be remembered by the one insensitive comment that someone makes. So really want to make sure everyone's prepared. Now, I've gone to a number of schools when they've had crisis events such as school shootings, and I find that sometimes the support staff are in a unique situation to observe how the children are doing and to be able to connect with them in different ways. So for example, there was one school that had a hostage situation, and ultimately one of the children was shot and killed in front of the rest of the class. And when I went and talked with the cafeteria staff sometime afterwards, they told me that they had concerns about the fact that the girls were wearing long-sleeve shirts. So I asked them why they thought that was relevant, and they explained to me that when the kids got on the lunch line and they held out their trays, the sleeves would retract and they could see that the girls had been cutting more. But they didn't think that the mental health staff or the teachers or the nursing staff was aware that that was happening. In that school, I also met with maintenance and custodial staff, and they told me that they had recognized that the children were now out of control. So I asked them to define what they meant by out of control behavior and to give me an example, and they said, well, the other day we were walking through the cafeteria and we saw a number of students get up and they left their trays behind. So we went over to them and reminded them, but they kept walking. So we stopped them and we said, well, if you don't pick up those trays, no one's going to clean up after you. So the kids went, they picked up their trays, they opened the door to the cafeteria and threw them outside and said, are you happy now? The trays aren't there anymore. And the custodian just looked at me and said, you know, these are good kids. They would never have been like this beforehand. He said, and what concerns me is they would never do something like that in front of the principal, in front of the teachers, in front of their parents. Really, we see a different side of them, and we're very concerned about them, and we don't know if the rest of the school is aware of this or doing anything. So you will find that different staff in the school can often observe things differently and may have a unique perspective, and they also have access to the students in a different way and may be able to provide support and assistance. So when I went to one school district that had been part of a focus of a large shooting with mass casualties, I talked with them and they were getting ready for their first day back at school. The event had actually occurred during the summer, and it was the start of the fall. And so at that point, I told them that you have to think about who's going to be the first face of the school that these children are going to see when they start school. And for many of the children, it was the bus drivers. So they actually pulled together the bus drivers to get some psychological first aid training. Maybe just think about it. If children are hesitant or anxious about returning to school, and they approach the bus on the first day and the bus driver says something like, well, hurry up and get on the bus, you're holding us up, or you're going to get in trouble, that it gives you a very different feeling than if the bus driver says, welcome to the first day, welcome back to school, let's get on the bus so we can get there soon. So really the way you present yourself and the way you approach children can be very important even among your support staff. So let me turn to this slide that lists a little bit more of the psychological first aid actions as described by the American Red Cross. And the first is just observation or awareness. And I'm going to address some of the common symptoms of adjustment difficulties. Although before I do that, I do want to point out that most children who have been through a crisis will show no symptoms. So you really shouldn't be looking simply for symptoms. Sometimes you have to go by their exposure and their experience to identify them as at need, but I will go over some of the symptoms. You then want to make a connection. You want to help people feel comfortable and at ease. You want to be kind, calm, and compassionate. The reality is that people often pick up on what we describe as the affective tone more than they pick up on the actual information. So people will often, when they're in stressful situations, respond to how you appear to be communicating more than what you're actually saying. So the way you deliver the information is important. You want to assist with basic needs that individuals have in crisis situations, and I'm going to address that next. You want to listen, but you want to make sure that you listen with comprehension. So you want to know what the likely reactions are and give consideration to what might be underlying issues or concerns that may not be directly communicated in the words. And so, when people ask you a question and you don't know exactly where it's coming from, it's often useful to probe that a little bit more and see why the child might be asking that. You want to then give realistic reassurance, and I mean, again, I want to emphasize it is realistic reassurance. False reassurance is not helpful and will lead to children and adults not trusting you. So you can't always tell people that they shouldn't be upset. So if children are upset, you can certainly explain to them why you might feel less concerned than they are and why they may not need to be as concerned. But if they are worried, then they are worried. And telling people that they shouldn't be worried just makes you come across as being insensitive and not helpful. So you give realistic reassurance, but then if they are concerned, what you need to do is to help them deal with that concern. And that gets to the next bullet, which is to encourage good coping. Good coping strategies are those that are not self-destructive, such as use of alcohol and other substances, and we'll come to that at a later point. You want to then help people who are in crisis to connect, help them identify supports in their family and the community. Particularly in this case, it would be where they can go in school to get supportive assistance. and help them figure out really how best to help others. As individuals in a crisis situation or in the aftermath of a crisis, if they are able to do something active to help others, that often helps them with their recovery as well. You want to then give accurate and timely information, but you don't want to go into unnecessary and graphic details. Individuals do not need to understand everything that's happened. They need to know enough of what's happened so they know what they should do and how they should react and what steps they can take to keep themselves safe or safer. But it isn't helpful to provide all information to people. You want to then suggest a referral source and become aware of community mental health resources and supportive services so that you can offer them to the families you serve in your schools. And then you want to end the conversation. Now, when you're doing psychological first aid in a community setting, all of these tasks are things which you generally spend about 10 to 15 minutes on. So the idea is to make a quick interaction with someone, help them understand what they're supposed to do and connect, where they should go for further resources and support, and then move on. So that's a kind of the basic strategy around psychological first aid, and I would suspect that a lot of this are things that educators and other school professionals do every single day with kids. So understand that those same skills are particularly useful in crisis situations. Now, in addition to providing psychological first aid, I also mentioned it's important to provide basic supportive services. So I'm going to give you an example that I've used a lot. I was working with a large healthcare system to talk about planning for certain disaster scenarios. We had just completed a tabletop activity where the scenario involved the need for mass decontamination. And after they had gone through the tabletop activity, they looked at me and they said, "That's right, we do need to think about the psychological needs." And so they asked me, what do you think people would need, or what questions should we ask to identify what needs they might have related to counseling or support at this point? So I said, well, let me make sure I understand the scenario. You have 500 individuals. They're at an athletic facility. There's an announcement made that although they can't see or smell anything, they've been exposed to a chemical agent that is the result of a terrorist attack. And if we don't do something, they may die, or those that they are with may die. So they are stripped of their clothing, and all of their personal belongings are permanently removed. We do not wipe off sarin and hand back cell phones in these settings. So anything they have is gone permanently. So at that point, they are standing naked, wet, cold, scared. They have no way of reaching those that they care about to make sure that they're okay, or to communicate to them that they've actually survived this terrorist attack. They have no way to get in their car. They have no way to drive anywhere. They have no way to get into their home. They don't have a driver's license. They have no identification, no credit cards, no cash. So in that situation, you have to realize that their basic needs take priority. Now, I've found that I'm often in meetings at a federal level, and people tend to talk in acronyms, which I don't think is useful, but I decided that it would be useful for my own credibility to create an acronym. So I created the acronym to describe what people need in that situation of UWF, which stands for underwear first. I also call it brief therapy. In Medicaid, you can bill for brief therapy. The issue is that when people are in situations like that, you really need to attend to their basic needs, and that would be for both children and adults, before they're able to acknowledge and address any additional emotional needs. And these basic needs are going to include safety, security, food, shelter, and communication and reunification with family and other significant caregivers. And I will highlight that the same is true for adults, including professionals. Staff have their own basic needs, and crisis preparedness and response plans need to consider them as a priority. So for an example, when we work with school systems, we explain to them that after a major disaster, particularly natural disasters, but even after a school shooting, one of the interventions, which is very simple for principals to plan for and to deliver, is to just hire at least a few substitute teachers that can roam through the school and provide temporary relief to the teachers. So if the teacher is becoming overwhelmed, or if a student is becoming overwhelmed and the teacher wants to attend to that particular child, he or she is able to do that while the substitute watches the class for a brief period of time. It also allows teachers to call up and see how their family members are doing, or to make sure that their house is being repaired after a natural disaster, or to make sure that, extended family members are attended to. So I remember when I was working in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, several months afterwards, and I heard a story that there was a minister who was giving the sermon, and somebody's cell phone went off in the audience. And a lot of people made comments to each other, and there was a lot of kind of murmuring about how inappropriate it was to have your cell phone on. But what the minister said was he stopped the sermon and he said, that might be your contractor. You better answer it. And the issue was, what he was communicating was that even literally the Word of God can wait. If you don't have a roof over your head for yourself and your family. And so by acknowledging that the basic needs of his parish were important to him and that he could acknowledge that, I think it led to the people in the parish thinking that this priest really truly cared and understood what they needed. So I think as a leader in a school system, it's extremely important that you make sure that your staff have their own basic needs met, in addition to making sure that the children and families do as well. Now, for some individuals, though, the psychological first aid and these basic supportive services are not actually going to be sufficient. And so the second and complementary approach is to identify and deliver services to those children who would benefit from additional mental health care. So one of the first steps in timely identification of those who need more help is to recognize potential symptoms of adjustment reactions, some of which are listed on the slide. Symptoms can include such things as sleep problems, and that may be trouble falling asleep, nightmares when you are asleep, frequent wakening, any difficulty waking in the morning. Really, any disruption in sleep pattern can be a problem. And when children don't sleep well, they don't concentrate very well the next day, and they don't function very well academically. You can see separation anxiety and school avoidance. So often children who have been through a crisis may be reluctant to leave their family for days, weeks, or even months afterwards, for concern that something may happen to them if they're not with their parents to care for them, or that something may actually even happen to their parents or siblings if they aren't there to provide some assistance and support. So after a disaster, I've been to some communities where, after Hurricane Katrina, there was one school system that was directly adjacent to New Orleans and actually doubled their population within a week. And they told me 4 months after Katrina that the majority of children who had relocated to their community and enrolled in school had still not shown up for a day of school. Some of this was, there was this summer in between, but there was a long period of time when many of the kids just didn't show up. And that the real challenge is that the schools are struggling to meet the needs of the students they had before the disaster, and they're also struggling to meet the needs of these new students who now came and had their own difficulties. If they transferred into the school, they didn't know what classes they were in, they didn't have friends, they didn't know where they should be placed, and they were having adjustment difficulties. So then they didn't have an influx of new teachers, and they didn't have an influx of new money. So they were struggling just to meet the needs of that population. And the last thing they really wanted to hear from me was that what they really had to do was go out and get the kids that hadn't even shown up, and that those were the ones that they probably should be most worried about. And as you can imagine, that's hard to do when you're struggling to meet the needs of the students already there, plus your staff have also been through the disaster as well, and they're not even functioning at the level beforehand. So you do need to make sure the kids that aren't coming to school, they are not just truant, they may actually be traumatized or struggling or have some other distress that's going on. Kids may also, as you imagine, as I'm sure you imagine, may demonstrate anxiety and trauma-related fears after a crisis event. They may be fearful of what happened, but they also may just be more fearful. So a disaster may occur during daylight, but they may become more afraid of the dark because developmentally that is a common fear. So that's how you can have anxiety, which means that you're more fearful, not necessarily requiring that you're fearful of the particular event recurring. Children and adults will have difficulties with concentration, and children will have deterioration in academic performance. I'll come back to this later. They may have trouble learning, remembering information, mastering new concepts. And teachers will often have difficulty concentrating enough to actually teach or to prepare their lesson plans or to grade papers or tests. Individuals will have regression. We often talk about children who start wetting their bed after they've been toilet trained, or have problems with separation in kindergarten when they didn't have that problem before, or they had gotten over that issue. But you can also see social regression, where children may become more clingy, they may be more demanding, less tolerant of change, more irritable, less flexible, and adults have the same type of regressive behavior. So you may see teachers getting upset more. Unfortunately, they often get upset with those in leadership positions, so principals and superintendents and elected officials are often the target of that irritability. And so you should expect that you will see some of that. One of the questions we ask schools after they've been a school shooting is whether the teachers are still yelling at the students more, because you can anticipate that they will do that. That's a common type of regressive behavior. I remember going to one community that had experienced some major natural disasters and had a lot of destruction of the community. And I went back to that school right after the summer, which was their first day back after the disaster. And unfortunately, there was severe weather that day, so it was very difficult for the children to return as well as for the staff. And I was talking with one of the parents, and I asked them how old their children were that they were concerned of, because they had come in for an evening presentation that I was doing for parents at the school. And one of the mothers just looked at me and she said, well, I have a number of children, but there are two I'm most concerned about. One is 5 years old, and the other is 35, and I don't know what to do with the 35-year-old. And at that point, her husband started crying and picked up a toddler and left the room. And so the issue was that he was so impacted that it was having a lot of impact on the children as well. So you should be looking for and anticipating regressive behavior. Sometimes we expect children to mature and rise to the occasion, but the reality is that after crisis events, when people are overwhelmed, they tend to actually to be more self-centered and have regressive behavior, at least temporarily. As you can imagine, when something bad happens, kids can get sad. You may actually see depression, and a lot of times you may see avoidance of previously enjoyed activities. So if children are no longer interested in doing what they were doing before, that may actually be a sign that they are having trouble adjusting to the event. We can see a new onset or increase of substance abuse, such as alcohol, tobacco use, and other substance use can be seen. And then somatization is just the recognition that many individuals who have had psychological distress will present with physical symptoms. So you may see that an increase of complaints to the school nurse or to others within the school about physical complaints. So school nurses are a good group to target for education in this area, because they often will be the ones who will see the children with complaints and need to help them make the connection between their psychological distress and their physical symptoms. Now this slide highlights what we can expect to see in schools in the absence of intervention after a school crisis. I already mentioned the decreased cognitive functioning and academic achievement. That could be related to the anxiety, with difficulty with concentration, sleep problems, and depression. All of those lead to drops in cognitive functioning and academic achievement. You also see an increase in absenteeism due to school avoidance, and then an increase in suspensions and expulsions because of this irritability, the social regression, and the substance abuse. So kids may not come to school, they may come to school and be sent home, or they may stay in school and not be able to learn as well. And when you put all of that together, it leads to an anticipated drop in graduation rates if there are not accommodations and supports put in place. So it used to be more years ago when I started doing this work that schools would say, well, we're not really here to provide emotional support, or it's up to the parents or the community to put the services in place for recovery. We're really here just to educate children. We do the work of learning. And my response to them was, well, taking time in schools to help children adjust to disaster and an aftermath is essential to promote academic achievement. So if that is all you were to do, if that is your only goal, you won't be able to do that either if you don't attend to some of the emotional and supportive needs of kids. Now, I've gone over some reactions, but I haven't talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this next slide goes over some of what to expect for the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So to qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD, children must have had exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And that can be through direct experiencing or witnessing of the event. But for children, the current criteria also allow that meeting the exposure criteria by simply learning that the event occurred to a close family member or friend, even if it wasn't witnessed and the child wasn't present. And as I go through these symptoms for these diagnostic criteria for PTSD, I do want you to think about the fact that they have been made more liberal, and as a result, I'm concerned that we may start diagnosing other things as PTSD. And the example that I'm going to give as I go through this has to do with bereavement that is from death of a natural cause, say the death of a parent from a car accident. The exposure criteria now can be met by someone coming home and telling the child that happened. They don't actually need to be in the car or to witness it. Now, to meet the criteria, you have to have symptoms in all four of the next core areas, and they must be present for at least 1 month. It has to be present for a month to qualify for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but you shouldn't wait a month for these symptoms, for those symptoms to be present before intervening. It's called acute stress, and it isn't post-traumatic stress until a month has passed. So the first is that there's some re-experiencing of the traumatic event. Now that can be through recurrent, intrusive, and distressing memories or dreams. Now in children, they can have frightening dreams without recognizing the content of the dreams or being able to remember what the dream was about. So in children, you can meet the criteria for re-experiencing simply by having children have recurrent distressing dreams of any nature if they don't remember what it's about. So children who have had a parent die will often have scary dreams. So they will meet that criteria. Now, the children can but don't have to have the dissociative reactions, the flashbacks that you'll hear more commonly in adults. And in children, they can also have trauma-specific reenactment that occurs in play, what we call post-traumatic play, which I'm happy to take questions on. In post-traumatic play, it is not the child working through the trauma in play. It is the child replaying the trauma in play. And so post-traumatic play is not therapeutic. It's actually a sign of post-traumatic stress. So that first component is the re-experiencing. The second is avoidance of stimuli, including even thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma. And I want to emphasize that this is a core symptom of PTSD, and it's one of the factors that prevents those impacted most severely from seeking professional help. And it's a reason why you have to do outreach and assessment after a crisis, because one of the core criteria is they avoid thinking or talking about it. So they often don't come forward, and individuals who are symptomatic with PTSD may go weeks, months, and even years without being identified because of this core feature, which is they avoid talking or thinking about it. Now, having said that, in bereavement, children will often avoid talking and thinking about that as well, so they may meet this criteria quite easily. The third one is negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the traumatic event, such as distorted cognitions about the cause, which leads them to feel guilty, or it may be just intense feelings of fear, horror, anger, or shame. And as you would imagine, that's quite common after a disaster, and it is also common in the setting of bereavement. And the last criteria is increased arousal, and that may be difficulty concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, self-destructive behavior, a state of hypervigilance, or an exaggerated startle. As you can imagine, the kids have trouble concentrating and sleeping after a parent has died as well. So, in fact, I'm concerned that a lot of children will actually qualify now for the diagnosis of PTSD when in fact they have something else such as bereavement. And the point I would like to make is that there really are a very wide range of reactions and concerns after a crisis. It's not just post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder or acute or post-traumatic stress symptoms. For those children whose family member or friend died as a result of the crisis, the bereavement may actually be their predominant problem. So I remember going out to one community that had a major community shooting where a large number of people were shot and killed. And I was talking to someone where the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was uninjured. And several weeks had passed, and he had come back to school once, but felt uncomfortable and left after a couple hours and had not returned to school, and also was not, had declined all offers for counseling, and also was not taking phone calls from people who were concerned and trying to reach out to him. But he was taking text messages, and he did give permission for us to visit him in his home. So I actually went with principal and another colleague, and we were talking with him, and he said that he didn't want counseling because he really wasn't having post-traumatic reactions, and he didn't want to talk about the shooting. He said he didn't know what was going on until he was pulled out after it had ended, and that, you know, I said, well, but you're not able to leave the house. And he said, well, I leave the house every night. I just go and I meet with my friends who were at the event. They understand what I was going through. I just don't want to talk about it anymore. He said, we're going camping. We're not afraid to leave. And so I said, well, then why weren't you staying in school? And he said, well, it didn't feel right to be there without my friend. And so he had a girlfriend that he had grown up with, and that's who he was with when the shooting occurred. And so he said it just wasn't right being in school without her. And so I looked at him and I said, well, maybe what's happening is you're grieving the death of your friend. And he looked at me and he said, that's exactly what it is. And if someone would talk to me about that, I would go in for counseling. I just don't want to talk about the shooting anymore. So the issue was no one offered him bereavement support. Everyone presumed that since he was a victim of a shooting, he had post-traumatic reactions. But when you're doing post-traumatic stress disorder evaluations and treatment, you're focusing on the event that caused the crisis, in this case the shooting. You can't really want to talk about the shooting. It wasn't what happened that day. It was the fact that today he's not going to be able to see someone that he cares deeply about, and that she will never be there in the future. So the treatment of PTSD is very different than bereavement support. So when disasters and crisis events occur, there's a lot of what we refer to as secondary losses and stressors which follow the event. So in communities that have experienced floods, for example, children have to go through relocation, the loss of their peer network, academic failure when they relocate to new schools, the challenges of integrating into new social networks. In communities that have had major disasters, there are often financial stresses within the school, I will tell you, as well as within the community, and that might result in parental unemployment or underemployment, with parental stress and mental health problems, marital conflict, or domestic violence. So the issue is when a crisis happens, all of these other things follow in a cascade, and what may actually be the problem for a child is the things that follow, not the actual event. They may have been at a hotel in Orlando when the hurricane hit, but they came home and found they didn't have their house, or their mother didn't have their job. So that it is not just the event, it's everything that follows, and you need to think about individuals' current stressors and losses, whether or not they're even connected to the event that occurred. The other challenge is that one crisis often awakens feelings related to pre-existing or past crisis events, even if they're completely unrelated. And that's a phenomenon that's kind of important to realize. So I was working with one school where it was a high school class, and they had gone on a field trip. And while they were on the bus, one of the girls had a necklace that had been given to her, and it had on it a bottle with some it was a clear bottle with some liquid in it. She became curious and she opened it up. It turns out it was actually a personal protective device. and it contained the liquid concentrate that's in pepper spray. And you're really only supposed to open it if you're being attacked or threatened. Apparently she didn't know that or became curious. I don't really know why she opened it up, but she did. And some kids started having an asthma attack. A couple kids, I think, were vomiting. A lot seemed overwhelmed by the fumes. So they stopped the bus and they evacuated and went into a fast food restaurant. And she went in as well, so they contaminated the fast food restaurant. And they ended up calling first responders. And initially it was felt that it might have been a chemical terrorist attack, and what they needed to do was do an on-scene decontamination. She came forward and told people what she had done and that no, it wasn't a chemical terrorist attack. So they went through what we call a controlled decontamination. They put the kids on a clean bus. They brought them to a children's hospital, and one by one the boys went out and showered outside the emergency room in an enclosed shower that's for decontamination. The girls went one by one in another shower. They had the wherewithal to take all of the teachers and chaperones and bring them into the hospital to shower, so that no one had, because I'm assuming it would be traumatic to see your teachers naked, and I'm guessing it's not helpful for the teachers either to be seen that way. So they were able to give the children and the adults new, clean clothing that they had acquired very quickly so that they were able to change into something else, and they were able to give them back their belongings. One girl lost a boot. They got together in an auditorium of a children's hospital where they were showing cartoons. They had cookies and punch and child life specialists and social workers, and they reunited them with their parents within an hour. So for a decontamination of a group of people, this is beyond well done. I would imagine it would be hard to ever do something like that again. But when I was talking with the school a couple of weeks afterwards, they questioned what they had done wrong. And I asked them why they would even think they did anything wrong, because cookies and punch and cartoon and child life specialists is really over the top good. So they told me that there were 2 girls who were having panic attacks and couldn't return to school for 2 weeks. And they wondered what they had done. And I said, stop asking about what you've done. All you have done is uncover a problem that these girls had beforehand. I didn't meet them. I didn't talk to them. But I told them, stop looking at that day. Look at what's happened beforehand or what's been happening since. There's something you need to know about these children and their lives. Well, one girl didn't take very long. She was new to the school. She'd only been there for a week before the episode had occurred. And when they found out why she was transferred, it was because her mother had been murdered a week before this occurred. And so they figured, well, that's what we uncovered. That's what we found out. Another girl, they kept coming back to me and saying, there isn't anything. We've asked. We've talked to the parents. We've talked to the girl. There's nothing. And I said, just keep looking. There's got to be something. It turned out that she was being raped by her father, and she hadn't disclosed it yet. So the point is, when you go to deal with one crisis event, you're not dealing just with that crisis. You're dealing with anything else that's difficult that's happened in the lives of the children and the staff. I remember going into one school where there was a young child, I think he was in 2nd grade, had found a gun, accidentally discharged it and accidentally killed his cousin, who was a student at the school. And when I went to talk with the kids, a group of kids got very upset, and when I talked alone with one of the girls, she disclosed that her mother was being physically abused by her boyfriend and was afraid she was going to die, and could I please get her help? And then when I talked with the teachers, one of the teachers started crying, and I had to stop the session and find out what was what was bothering her, because she was very upset. And she chose at that point to disclose that she had miscarried. But she had miscarried 20 years prior and hadn't disclosed it before to her peers. So the issue is, you go in and deal with one event, you deal with everything else that's going on. Now, the same thing does occur, though, that future events can lead to temporary resurgence of the same feelings associated with the crisis. So we refer to this as grief triggers and trauma triggers. So something that you say or do, or something that's a reminder. It could, for grief triggers, can be almost anything. Substitute teacher comes in and uses the same perfume as a child's mother used to wear, and all of a sudden now she starts crying or is upset because she remembers how much she misses her mother in the middle of math class. So grief triggers can occur and trauma triggers can occur. So you need to recognize that these associations can happen and be prepared. Now, with all of this going on, as you would imagine, it is quite common for kids to have distress after there's been a crisis event. But it turns out that parents and other adults that support children, whether that be teachers, often underestimate the extent of children's reactions to a crisis situation, especially when you're talking about how they feel, what we call internalizing symptoms. We can observe their behaviors, but we can't tell how they're feeling unless we talk with them. This was one of the posters to try and emphasize this. It was put up by Project Liberty about 6 months after September 11. And they all have the same kind of slogan, if only the signs were this easy to read, but they aren't. And children may attempt to withhold the symptoms, the complaints about their symptoms, because of concerns that it makes them abnormal or it's just inappropriate, or because, quite frankly, they want to protect their parents or other adults who are also upset in these settings. Parents may actually be aware of the symptoms, but still fail to report them to the school or to healthcare providers because they may think that professionals aren't interested in hearing about them. A lot of times after disasters, you'll hear the expression, they're just normal reactions to an abnormal event. But the problem is you wouldn't go and tell people about normal reactions. And I think the better way of phrasing this would be even psychologically healthy individuals such as yourself, when they find themselves in situations such as this, may experience distress, that we can help if we provide support. Do I have your permission to get you that help? People are much more likely to say yes than if we say, well, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Do you think you need counseling? People in that situation are much more likely to say, no, I'm okay, even when they're not. So up until this example that I was seeing a 6-year-old girl who had had a dog bite. She was attacked by a pit bull. She had actually had it, the wound on her leg had been sutured in multiple layers, and a couple of weeks had passed, and she was coming back for a wound check. And the physician that saw her first asked how she was doing, and she said she was doing fine, and the mother said she was doing fine, but he wanted me to come in and take a look at the wound. And so I went and I asked the mother, how is your child doing emotionally? And she said, she's doing fine, thanks for asking. And I asked the girl, she can't just ask the parent. And the girl smiled and said, thank you, doctor, for asking, but I'm doing fine. And so then I just asked the mom, well, how's she doing in school? And the mother said, I don't know. And I said, well, why don't you know? And she goes, well, she won't go back to school. She's afraid the dogs are going to attack her. I said, well, how's she sleeping? She goes, she has nightmares every night. And I said, well, does she startle easily? And she goes, oh, yeah, if you make any noise, she jumps. She's afraid dogs are going to attack her. So we went through how to provide support to her and explained that we were interested and available to help with that. And before I left the visit, I just said, could you explain to me, why did you say she was doing fine, both you and your daughter, when it doesn't sound like she's doing fine? I just want to understand that better. And the mother looked at me very simply and said, well, if you were attacked by that dog, you'd do exactly the same thing. And I realized we don't ever say it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event when it's a physical problem. So if someone's hemorrhaging to death, we don't say shock is just the normal reaction to the abnormal event of massive blood loss. We dial 911. But there's so much stigma related to mental illness, and that does not go away after a disaster or a crisis event. And so sometimes we really don't permit people to get services, and we have to be cautious about how we offer them. When dealing with the psychological first aid, that's part of the education. So two last things I want to go through is one is to talk about the timeline for recovery from a crisis event. So if you can imagine that the point from A to B is your baseline, it is not a straight line. Individuals have good days and they have bad days, and they may be exposed to something that's upsetting or challenging or difficult, but they return to their baseline without intervention. In crisis situations, they don't return to their baseline. That's why it's a crisis and not a bad day or bad event. So at point B, a crisis event has occurred. By point C, individuals are feeling vulnerable. And by point D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. At this point, communities rally together, resources are brought to bear after major disasters, and individuals start to improve. So you will see some improvement by point E or perhaps point F. But I do want to point out that for some individuals, this is actually a vulnerable time period because they may start to get better, but may feel helpless and hopeless and worry that they will, or conclude falsely, that they will never get back to the way they were. And this is actually when we see an increase in suicide behavior. That often happens a couple months afterwards. So we have worked with a number of schools that have had a school shooting, and then a couple months later or weeks later start to have a suicide cluster or suicide risk increasing among their students. The point is, when you see improved functioning, if you withdraw support and say, well, look, kids are resilient, they're getting better, and assume that they will now just get back to their baseline without any additional help, for some children they will not, and the same for adults. You may actually establish a new baseline, which I just call here continued impairment. We need to support children and adults until they get back to their baseline, and if there is sufficient support and assistance and enough internal resiliency, kids and adults may actually exceed their baseline. And that's what we call post-traumatic growth, where individuals, they come out of a crisis or a disaster with more spirituality, higher priorities placed on the needs of others, more empathy, more coping and resiliency skills. A lot of these people go into education and medicine because they want to help others. The problem with that is, as I mentioned, you bring a crisis and trauma with you into the future. It may be uncovered when you are exposed to others who are in distress. So the last thing I want to go over was the importance of professional self-care. It's important we recognize it is distressing to be with people who, in general, and children in particular, who are in distress. If someone's crying or upset, it's really hard to feel like you're helping them, even if you are. So we have to make sure that staff find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who are grieving or traumatized that it's having on them personally and professionally. We need to create a culture where it's okay at times to be upset, where everyone looks out for each other, normalizes asking for help, and models a willingness to accept assistance. And a place where people help each other see the benefit of the important role that schools can play in supporting children in the aftermath of crisis and loss. And principals and superintendents play a critical role in setting that culture. So the last story I'm going to give you was I was at a conference a number of years ago, and it was geared to educators. And there was, after the conference ended, I was in a large ballroom, and I stayed after to answer questions for about a half an hour. And finally, there was one person left. He was all the way in the back of the ballroom. So I walked over to him and I asked him if he had any questions, and he said no. And I said, well, can I help you? And at that point, he just started crying. He said, I don't know if you can. So I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he was a superintendent in a school district outside of the United States. And he told me that there had been a bus accident and a number of children had died. And he said, you know, it's a couple of years now, and most of the time I'm okay, but there are times when it still upsets me, and it bothers me that these children died. And then he looked at me and he said, well, maybe I should retire. And my comment to him was, if you're superintendent and you don't care if kids die, then you should retire. I would never want a superintendent or principal to be responsible for the life of kids if they didn't care whether or not they died. So the point is, the caring makes us vulnerable. But it's an important part of what we have to do. So what I do want to say is that, you know, I direct the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, and we provide free technical assistance and consultation, and we also have a number of resources that are available. We have a parent guide on supporting a grieving child, supported by the New York Life Foundation. We have guidance documents on how to address the death of a student or staff in a school. There's one for death of all causes, one specifically for suicide. It has templated letters and sample scripts to read to students. We have documents on psychological first aid, guidance on addressing anniversary of a crisis, and even guidance document for school security staff. The website for our center is schoolcrisiscenter.org. There is an online training module that I had developed for the National Center for Disaster Medicine and Public Health that talks about the psychosocial impact of disasters on children if you want to refer to an online training module. The last resource that I wanted to bring to your attention is grievingstudents.org. Grievingstudents.org was set up by the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. NASSP is one of the founding members of the coalition, and through that we provide free downloadable learning modules that are video modules with print material that summarizes it on a wide range of topics related to bereavement that's developed by and for school professionals. So please make that resource known to people. It's just at grievingstudents.org. And at this point, I'm going to open it up and see if there are any questions that people have.
Dr. Schonfeld, at this point, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but two others have come in otherwise, and so I'd like to put those to you. Do many students have persistent adjustment problems is the first question.
Yes. When there have been major disasters, large numbers of children will have some reactions, often persisting for a long period of time. I worked with New York City after 9/11, and they had done a study which they felt was as a needs assessment, and it was conducted 6 months after September 11th. It was done by Applied Research and Consulting, Columbia School of Public Health, and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And they actually surveyed a sample of over 8,000 students attending grades 4 through 12. And they used passive consent, particularly for the older students, so it was a very representative sample. And they asked kids about how they were doing. And the kids, in order to have what they thought was a probable psychiatric disorder, they had to report symptoms that were consistent with the diagnostic criteria for that disorder. Plus, they also had to report that they were having trouble with their day-to-day functioning. So it's considered a fairly conservative self-report measure. And they actually found that 6 months out, 1 of every 4 children, 27%, met the criteria for 1 or more probable psychiatric disorder. So approximately 1 out of 10 had PTSD, major depressive disorder, separation anxiety disorder, panic attacks, and 15% had agoraphobia, the fear of going out or taking public transportation. So based on that, they estimated that over 250,000 students attending New York City public schools required counseling related to that one event. What was even more concerning at one level was that the majority, so more than 50% of these children who self-reported their symptoms and self-reported that they were having trouble in day-to-day functioning, also reported that they had never sought care for it. And that's despite the fact that Project Liberty established free counseling in every school, in the school system. So it was on-site, freely available, and it was in response to an event that was a very public event. And the majority of the kids who knew they needed help had still never asked for it. And also concerning was that nearly 9 out of 10, or 87% of the students, reported at least one post-traumatic symptom persisting 6 months afterwards. And so it turns out that a large number of children have diagnoses that qualify for diagnoses of major mental health problems, and the vast majority of children have at least a problem or concern. So 76%, 3 out of 4 of the students reported often thinking about the attacks at the World Trade Center, and about half of them reported trying to avoid thinking, hearing, or talking about it even 6 months later. So what you will see is that it is persistent, and it is large numbers of kids.
Thank you. Another question is, what do we know about common significant mental health problems, about how common significant mental health problems are among students after a major crisis?
Right. As I said, I mean, you will see them in the majority of kids will have some challenges. About 1 out of 4 students said that it was hard for them to keep their mind on things. 1 out of 4 students said they were still having problems sleeping. 17% had nightmares. So it was just a range of common persistent reactions. Again, this is 6 months afterwards. And the reason that I say this is I think we have a tendency in schools to think about, well, what we need to do is screen children and refer them. Well, if 87% of them need to be referred, that doesn't make sense. I mean, that's the vast majority of the kids in the school. So I think after you deal with, in situations of major disasters or crisis events, we have to think about services that we can provide broadly within the school to all kids. And they can't just be mental health providers delivering them, because otherwise we'd pull 9 out of 10 kids out of class. But it probably makes sense to deliver it to all the kids in the class. Now, if you happen to be in a community that's characterized by a lot of loss or trauma, maybe a community with large amounts of violence and gang-related activities, you should expect the vast majority of children have experienced something that's traumatic or experienced loss. And I think there's a tendency in those situations to say, well, the kids just get used to it. I don't think they get used to it. They just get used to the fact that the adults aren't going to help them. So they stop asking for the help. They realize it's not going to be forthcoming. Children in that environment don't get used to it. They just get multiply traumatized or have cumulative loss. And in those situations, they actually engage in counterphobic behavior, what we call reactive risk-taking. They put themselves in the same situations that place them at risk, not because they don't realize it's risky, but precisely because they do realize it's risky and they're afraid of dying. And so they will engage in behaviors that would put them at risk with the hope that they can prove to themselves that they're not going to die. And unfortunately, when you do that, some kids do die or get injured. And so it is not a healthy way of dealing with the risk. But I think that the adults tend to assume, well, look, they play with guns. They must not realize you can die. They do realize that, and they're scared of it. And that's precisely the reason why many of them put themselves in that risk situation. So I guess that in answer to the question, it's very common, and in some communities it's almost universal. But just because it's very common does not mean that they get used to it, and it also doesn't mean that it isn't a problem. It just means that we've kind of failed to protect kids in those situations, and their need is quite high.
Thank you again. For those who are tuned in, this is Dr. David Schonfeld, Director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, who has been our presenter today. Dr. Schonfeld, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. I'd like to reiterate to our audience that your invitation is waiting for you. Come with us next year in February from the 25th to the 27th to Orlando for the 100th NASSP anniversary celebration. It'll be Ignite 16, our annual conference. We're looking forward to seeing you there. Again, this webinar will be accessible on www.nassp.org/webinars video sometime in the next 48 hours. And again, join me in thanking Dr. Schonfeld for his time this afternoon. Really appreciate your efforts, and keep up the good work, Dr. Schonfeld. I know there's lots of need out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, end today's webinar. Again, any questions, please let us know that what we can follow up with you on, and tune into our website to see the slides again and share them with folks on your staff. Take care.